It's my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I am your host for tonight, Mary Jane Calderon, joining you from my office at Behringer-Crawford Museum. Also joining me by the powers of Zoom is our guest presenter, Dr. Brian Hackett, and my assistant, Heather Cook. So thank you both for being here. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's history museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carrell Ann and Ralph V. Hale Jr. Foundation, and our members. If you're not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for exclusive access to discounts and programming. Learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. We would love to hear from our viewers tonight, so if you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and I will be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. Let's meet tonight's presenter. Dr. Brian L. Hackett is an associate professor at Northern Kentucky University, where he leads the department's master's degree program in public history. With a Ph.D. from Middle Tennessee State University and an MS from Eastern Illinois University and a BS from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, Dr. Hackett brings a wealth of academic and practical experience to his students and research. He has managed historic sites and museums throughout his career, serving as the executive director of the Montgomery County Historical Society from 1992 to 2004, and the executive director of the Ross County Historical Society from 1987 to 1992. He was also the curator of collections for the Olmsted County Historical Society from 1985 to 1987. Dr. Hackett has authored a book and developed an exhibit marking the 150th anniversary of St. Elizabeth Hospital. His public history students have also contributed to creating exhibits for museums across the region, including in New Richmond, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Newport, Kentucky. So thank you, Dr. Hackett, again for being here. Now, before we get started, there is a quiz question tonight. The first respondent to enter a correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live wins a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize, and most importantly, bragging rights. So tonight's question is, Henrietta Scott Cleveland, who is the true inspiration for founding the hospital, had one request on her own behalf of the sisters. What was that request, and when was it fulfilled? So it's a two-part question. So go ahead and get those answers in the chat, and we'll go ahead and stop sharing our screen. And Dr. Hackett, if you're ready, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Sounds great. Been looking forward to this for quite a while. So let me get this thing up and running. There we go. Can everybody see that? I think so. Well, I'm gonna go ahead.
Looks good. Sorry.
Good. It's my pleasure to speak to you this evening. I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite stories. I am a public historian, which means I work in museums and historic sites and anywhere where the public gets their information about history. And as you will learn from me, if you know me for very long, history is a good story well told. And I think the story of St. Elizabeth Hospital is one of those great stories because it's an unlikely story. It comes with pitfalls and excitement and irony, and I think it's something that I just love to share, and I hope you enjoy it as well tonight. So without further ado, I think we'll get started. Remember how we advance here. Yes, there we go. Let's look at the mid-1800s when we're talking about Covington and Northern Kentucky. The best way to describe Northern Kentucky was that it's a real mess. A lot of things are going on that are not very savory, and there's a lot of changes going on. And so things that really shape our community, of course, are things that we would not put up with very much today. Disease was rampant. Prostitution was legal. Alcohol abuse was prevalent. In fact, if you go into the 1870 census, in the 1880 census, prostitution is legal and it's listed in the census. And you can actually find where the houses of prostitution were in all sorts of places in Northern Kentucky. It's true of other places in the United States, but you can find those here. You can imagine also because there was a military fort here, that there was a lot of young men, and that brought in alcohol use and that brought in prostitution. And also other things were happening too. There was a great industry starting. And so that brought in people from outside. And a lot of people from outside were from different places in America, and they usually came poor looking for jobs. And what's interesting about that is that these people were new and they didn't have family support. And that's kind of ironic that there was no place for them to go. And so a lot of Northern Kentucky was facing a lot of things similar to what we're facing today. There were immigrant problems. There was race problems. There was religious issues that were determining things. We were changing. And with change always comes concern and worry. And so that's what was going on. And so there was a lot of substandard housing. And in 1861, when St. Elizabeth Hospital opened, slavery was legal. And Cincinnati was the center of the debate over what was freedom and what was not freedom. And so there was a lot of tension. And so this is kind of the field that St. Elizabeth Hospital was founded in. So if you can get that picture in your head, you'll understand what a great accomplishment this was. So there's what you've got in Northern Kentucky is you've got a lot of poor and middle class Northern Kentuckians that need help. They didn't have resources. They didn't have money. There wasn't a lot of space. Quite often, these families were very poor, living in substandard housing. And of course, substandard housing, living close together, that spreads disease. And you have to do something because these people really had no place to go. Traditional sources did not work because there were no such, at the time, hospitals were very rare. So people were usually being taken care of at home. And there wasn't enough space for that. So Northern Kentucky needs a revolutionary answer. It needs visionaries. It needs people to say, this is how we've got to change things. We've got to do something. And quite frankly, what Northern Kentucky needed was 2 women. And these women who saw what was going on in this community saw that there needed to be change. So there were a couple of women really key to this story. The first is Sarah Worthington Parker. And she had a friend whose name was Henrietta Cleveland. And Henrietta Cleveland was probably the person most responsible for the creation of St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Sarah Worthington Parker was the daughter of Thomas Worthington. Thomas Worthington had been the 6th governor of the state of Ohio, and she was primarily responsible for founding a hospital in Cincinnati years earlier. And so Henrietta Cleveland, who had been born into wealth, and she was a very well-connected person in Northern Kentucky, had a rough family life, to be honest with you. Her husband and her children died of different diseases that affected her greatly when she was still a young woman. So she was looking for a way to find peace in herself and discovered the Catholic Church as a way to find peace and make sense of her world. She also understood, because of what happened to her family and what she could see around her, is that the poor in Northern Kentucky had no place to go when it came to health and no hospital. There was no medical services for them. And so the only thing that had worked in the past is getting the help of the Catholic Church. So Henrietta Cleveland, talking to Sarah Worthington Parker and others, and then eventually approaching the church about it. And the church was, at the beginning, was not very excited about the possibility of starting a church in Northern Kentucky, advised her to go to the Vatican and go to Rome and pitch a case there. And when she was there, she met a woman by the name of Frances Shriver. Now, Frances was a young nun. She also had come from a very prosperous family, but she saw what modernization and industrialization had done to the working poor. And she was very devout. And so she got together and she formed the Franciscan Sisters of the Poor, which was a small order focused on their efforts to helping those in need through hospitals. That's exactly what we needed here. So when Francis and Henrietta got together, it was decided that was the order, that was the service organization that was going to come set up a church, or excuse me, set up a hospital in northern Kentucky. Henrietta Cleveland was a remarkable individual. After her husband and children died, she dedicated her money to the helping of the poor. She was a force to be reckoned with, from what I understand. And it was very hard to say no to this woman. And she knew that what northern Kentucky needed is it needed a hospital, because poor people had no place to go. There was a problem, however. Hospitals are a very uncomfortable and unpopular idea to most people. They felt that hospitals brought in the wrong kind of people. Decent people didn't use hospitals. Decent people instead would stay home and would be treated in their homes. So hospitals were set up for people who had no money and had no place else to go. They were considered undesirable. In addition to that, there was a belief that when you brought a hospital into your community, you also brought in diseases. You brought in cholera, you brought in smallpox, you brought in all sorts of diseases because the hospital was there treating people with it. And a lot of people didn't understand what causes diseases and how to prevent them. And so they were very superstitious about it. So Henrietta needed an ally. And of course, she found that ally in the Catholic Church, which had given her such peace when her children and her husband had died. So, as I said, she went off to the Vatican to talk to the Vatican about getting permission to start a hospital in northern Kentucky. Henrietta's Catholic faith had brought her through a lot of very troubled times. And she thought that this was the best way that she could help the people in northern Kentucky. And this was a very stressful time for her. I hope I'm not going too fast. So Frances Shriver, who was the nun that she was working with, they met in Rome. And Mary Frances Shriver was a founder of a small order of nuns. And this small order of nuns dressed very plainly. In fact, they dressed in brown, and they were called sparrows, actually. And so her Sisters of the Poor of St. Francis was the order that she founded, and they were dedicated to working in hospitals with the extreme poor. This is exactly what we needed. So they were the ones that were picked to run the hospital. Seems easy enough. We've got a group, and we're going to run a hospital. But yet there was challenges. Well, there were a couple things going on. First of all, they needed money, and money was not going to be easy. But money was going to be a lot easier to overcome than some of the other problems. There were three main challenges that were facing the Henrietta and the nuns who wanted to start the hospital and the church that was backing them. First of all, they were Catholics. Second, they were immigrants, German immigrants, no less. And three, they wanted to start a hospital, which is not a popular idea anyway. So these were three big unpopular ideas that these women had to face. So how did they overcome them? But let's explore those questions first. Okay, so in America at this time, in the mid-19th century, there was a bias against Catholics. Catholics were considered by very many people, a lot of Protestants in America, as being some outside force that nobody knew anything about. And this picture that you see right here is a political cartoon from a New York newspaper talking about the evil of the Catholics coming in to destroy America. And this is from about the 1850s. So it's about the same time the hospital was founded. And there's a couple things you should note here. As you see, there's a lot of children on the banks of this river, the American River Ganges. And they're hiding, and they're defiant, and they're hiding from alligators. or they're trying to get away from the alligators. Do you see the alligators? Those alligators are people wearing pope hats. And of course, the teeth are the hat. And these people and these representatives of the Vatican are coming to shore to destroy our children. You'll also notice in this picture, way in the back on the left-hand side, you'll notice that there's Rome, there's the Vatican, and it's controlling this attack on America. You'll also notice in the center of the picture, up to the top of the picture, you'll notice that there is it says U.S. Public Schools. And obviously it's a destroyed ruin. And if you look very closely, you'll see the American flag being hung upside down. And that was because of the belief that Catholics wanted to set up their own schools, that they would eventually lead to the destruction of the American school system. Also, you'll notice up in the upper right hand, you'll see a woman with her hands tied behind her back and two people leading her into the distance to the gallows. Most people look at this and they say, oh, that's Lady Liberty, but it's not. It's actually Columbia. Before Uncle Sam and before the Liberty Statue of Liberty, the symbol for America was a young woman called Columbia. And they are taking Columbia hands tied and they're taking her to the gallows. This is a very strong comment about what people believed Catholics were going to do to America. Because they were immigrants, they were not from around here, and they owed their loyalty not to the United States, but to the church. Now, of course, we don't believe any of this stuff anymore. It's all crazy, but this is what people believed. Excuse me. They were afraid of brainwashing. They were afraid that this was a Protestant nation and somehow the Catholics were going to destroy it. And so people were very suspect of Catholics. And if you remember this, I've got a story that's coming up in a little bit that will highlight this. The other problem was that they were immigrants, specifically German immigrants. Now, there was a perception at this time that two types of immigrants were the worst for America, and they were the Irish and the Germans. And this is a political cartoon also of the same era, showing election polls. You see that building in the back, and you see a riot. There's a fight going on. People are fighting over politics. And then these two fine gentlemen that you see in the foreground, one in a barrel of Irish whiskey, the other in a lager beer barrel. And what are they stealing? They're stealing the ballot box, because we can't let these immigrants vote. We can't let them do that because they will destroy America. And so you have a rather interesting characterization here. And this is really what's happening. So these are two of the challenges that these sisters are actually having to put up with when they get here. You've probably heard this stuff more recently. They're stealing our jobs. They're voting illegally. They're from an inferior race. It's kind of interesting because in 1848, there was a headline in a newspaper in New York City. And it said that the first interracial marriage had taken place in the city, and they hoped that it never would happen again. But the races that they called that were two different races was a German marrying an Irish person. Because at the time, people actually believed that race had to do more with your nationality than your family tree. So they believed that a German and an Irish were two different races, and not very good races either. Sad to say, but that's what people believed. Of course, there's a lot of things they believe that we think are hilarious today. So they were upset because they didn't speak English as a first language. This is rather interesting because at this time in Cincinnati, there were 4 German newspapers and 1 English newspaper. So this was a very big concern of people, that their livelihood and what they were used to was going away. Also added this just for fun, so I apologize if I insult anybody. But there was the other complaint that some people had, is that these new immigrants ate foods that they weren't used to. Of course, we can all probably imagine what those foods were, but specifically Geta. Non-Germans and um, old-timers, shall we say, people that have lived here a long time, thought that Geta was not a food suitable for humans. And so it's kind of interesting that if we had to pick a national food, if it's not chili here in Cincinnati, it certainly would be Geta. They also believe that these both Irish and the Germans, who were quite often Catholic, did weird things like worship the Pope, which we all know is not true, but it's what people believed. And of course, at a time before modern social media, it's interesting how some of these rumors spread so quickly. Of course, the last challenge that these people ran into was the fact that they were trying to set up a hospital. And hospitals were not popular at all. Not like today, we're grateful to have hospitals in our communities. People did not want to have hospitals because hospitals brought diseases, and you didn't want to have a disease. This is another political cartoon of the time. This was a Marine hospital in New England being raided by angry crowd because they felt that the people who were in the hospital brought disease to the community. They even felt that hospitals were not for decent people, that if you were a decent person, you suffered and were treated in your home. If you had to use a hospital, then you were not worthy of being in the community. It's interesting to note, and this is a sideline, but it's very interesting to note that they did the same thing for funeral parlors. Prior to the modern era, which means from 1900 on, people had parlors in their homes, and in those parlors, that's where you had grandma's funeral. Only people who were poor and didn't have decent homes used funeral homes. And it's interesting to note that you may have recalled your grandmother or great-grandmother referring to a room as a parlor. Well, about the 1920s, the furniture industry tried to change the image of the parlor. And they actually, through advertising, changed the name of the parlor to what we now call the living room, to get the idea of death in the parlor and a funeral in the parlor as something of the past. And they wanted to sell you furniture that was more comforting. And so they tried actively to destroy the name parlor and change it to the family room or to the living room. So it's interesting how that is very similar to the viewpoint on hospitals. So these fine ladies, these nuns in the Catholic Church, had these three strikes to begin with. And so it leads to some very interesting stories. So this community was very much divided. There were some that wanted the hospital and joined the fight. They looked to raise money. They went out and had special events. Political pressure was put on the government of Covington to support the idea of a new hospital. Bishop Carrell told the Catholics in the area that it was their duty to help fund the hospital. He arranged for fundraising events and fairs, mortgaged property that the church owned in order to start St. Elizabeth Hospital, which was pretty bold at the time, mortgaging and selling things in order to get money to start a hospital. But at the same time, there were protests. There was an active effort by some people in politics, some elected officials, to prevent the city from contributing money to the new hospital because that was inappropriate. They did not want the hospital and therefore did not want to support it. So this again was something that they had to overcome. So what was the result of this fight? The result of this fight is that the good guys won, at least temporarily. And so on January of 1861, at a cost of $2,272.05, Northern Kentucky opened its first hospital, the first St. Elizabeth Hospital. And here's a rendering of it. It was in an old storefront. It sat on 7th Street, and it boasted 10 beds. And of course, it opened and it started slowly. People started to trickle in, but eventually it took off. So let's look at some of those stories. First patient was a guy by the name of Louis Meyer. Sometimes it's spelled M-E-Y-R, and sometimes it's M-E-Y-E-R. But anyway, Louis Meyer had been a laborer. He was not from the area. He brought his family here to work in the factories. And he was brought into the hospital on January 23rd, 1861. He was 35 years old. He was married, had 3 young children, and was dying. He had a wasting disease. Sometimes it was called rheumatism, but the fact is that he had lost the strength in his body. He couldn't dress himself, he couldn't take care of himself, and he was very weak, and he was obviously dying. And his family lived in a tenement house and had no room and couldn't take care of him. He was too big for his wife to handle, so they were able to bring him to the hospital. They made him as comfortable as possible, and he seemed to improve some. But on March 11th, 1861, he passed away. Now, it's kind of interesting. When I was working on the book, I decided to look into what happened to his family. The census that I found, the next census, which was the 1870 census, I found 2 of his children living in a boarding house in Covington. And unfortunately, there was no mention of the mother or the other son. But this was a 17-year-old boy and a 13-year-old boy living together in this tenement house. And the people on either side of their apartment were prostitutes. So it looks to me like after father died, things did not go well. And the family either broke up due to circumstance or due to death. And so, but it kind of illustrates the kind of people that would end up at the hospital who really had no other choice. The second story about that time, almost at the same time that the gentleman was there, we had another person come to the hospital, and she was an enslaved woman. And she arrived that January. She came to the hospital eventually on She arrived at the hospital late one January night. It started out when the sisters got a request from a local minister. His name was Thomas Fisher, and he was a prominent Baptist minister and leader of a group called the Anti-Reform Movement in the Baptist Church. And he had an enslaved woman who was his servant, housekeeper. And she was sick. In fact, she was so sick that she complained and cried a lot because she felt so much pain. And this is where the story gets very strange. So the Fisher had the nurses, the nuns come to his place to see if they could help the woman. And they convinced him that they couldn't do much for her at his house, that they could take her back to the hospital, which he was very pleased with because he found that she was an annoyance, that he didn't like her crying and wailing and being in so much pain. So he said that they could take her to the hospital, but only under certain conditions. And those conditions were that they do not pray over her, they do not give her the sacraments, they do not waste time teaching her about religion or faith. So I was wondered why he was so specific about that. And I did some looking into the life of Thomas Fisher. Thomas Fisher, of course, Baptist minister, part of the anti-reform movement, like I said. The anti-reform movement was actually a movement within the Baptist church to try to, best way to describe it, go back against the reforms of the church and go back to a more, what they believe to be a more biblically accurate dealings of the church. Part of that belief was that African Americans, people of color, were inferior, part of an inferior race, and therefore, like animals, did not have souls. And he truly believed, from what I can tell from his writings, were that if you prayed with someone of color, if you baptized a person of color, if you gave them the sacraments, that was an insult to God. That would be like, baptizing your dog, and therefore it was an insult. And so he would not have that. He would not allow that to happen. He told them up front that they could not and would not. He would not allow that. And this is a problem because, of course, she's going to a Catholic place. But the problem was real because this was very serious. Because Henrietta, who's a woman's name, in the eyes of the law, was actually property. And because of the way the law was written, no one could do anything to your property that you did not approve of. And the nuns, if they went against what he wanted, could actually go to prison, and they could force the closure of St. Elizabeth Hospital. It was that big a deal. So what did the sisters do? Well, they reported to a higher authority, and they actually did everything that he didn't want done. They prayed with her. They talked to her about the Bible. They gave her a Bible. They baptized her. They gave her the sacraments. She probably for the first time in her life was surrounded by people who really cared about her. And she improved, but not enough, because she eventually did die. Part of the rule that Reverend Fisher wanted is when she died, they were not to do anything but call him, and he would arrange to have the body removed and buried in a cemetery somewhere in the city in an unmarked grave. They did so. They blessed her. They got her ready. After she passed away, they gave her last rites, but they dare never say anything to Reverend Fisher. I think this is a reflection of how honorable these women were, how honorable St. Elizabeth Hospital was, and quite frankly, how bad some people can get. I often wonder what happened to Reverend Fisher when he appeared before the pearly gates. One can only wonder. But it was both a sad story and a happy story, and an enlightening story about St. Elizabeth Hospital. And one of my favorite stories about Northern Kentucky that I love telling people about. Not all the encounters that the nuns had were so steep and solemn. There's a great story another story that I love. Falls under the category of winning friends and converts. There was a gentleman who was working out in his backyard, and he was growing potatoes, and he was harvesting some of his potatoes. And one of the sisters came by and said, "Excuse me, sir, I can't help to notice that you're harvesting some potatoes. Would you mind donating some so that we could use them at the St. Elizabeth Hospital?" His immediate response says that he didn't have any potatoes nor money to give to any blank Catholics. And I got this illustration of a guy being angry. Anyway, he told her to go away, and that he didn't have any time or money or potatoes or anything for what he said, damn Catholics. Well, a little later that day, his buddies show up and they decide to go hunting. And something happened while they were hunting, and a gun went off prematurely, and it shot the man. So his friends grabbed him, and quickly as they could, they carried him to St. Elizabeth Hospital, where that same nun was in charge of his care. She bandaged him up. He was unconscious, and the first thing he saw when he woke up from being unconscious was the very nun that he had told to go away earlier that day. They said he became the biggest supporter of the hospital and raised thousands of dollars in support of it. He became, as they said, a friend of St. E's for life. That's one of those great stories that always makes me laugh. I hope you enjoyed it as well. So things were going really well. And in fact, people began to think, hey, maybe this isn't such a bad idea after all. This hospital seems to be a good thing. In fact, I understand that the first year that the hospital was open, only 13 people who went into the hospital died. Of the 100 or so people that were serviced by the hospital, they had a very high survival rate. And people began to notice. People weren't just going to the hospital to die as expected, they were actually getting well and going back to work. The 10 beds were almost always full, and sometimes the sisters had to go into private homes to help people because there wasn't enough beds at the hospital. Covington in northern Kentucky needed a bigger hospital. This time it would be different. People seemed to be on board. Everybody thought this would be a great idea. However, there was still few people who didn't like the idea of the cities giving money to Catholics. So the city worked out an idea that they would actually buy beds at the hospital that could be reserved for special cases that the city could send. So they could use, the hospital could use the beds, could use them, but if the city ever needed them, they'd be available. So that was one of the ways they worked their way around the city paying for a new hospital. So while one of the sisters was out, she heard story that there was a building for sale, and it happened to be the former Baptist seminary. Now, the Baptist cemetery, which is pictured here, after it became Second St. Elizabeth Hospital, had actually been a seminary for the Baptists, but the Baptists had split over the issue of slavery, which caused a split at the seminary, and it caused the seminary to be closed. And so the sister heard that the building was available for $15,000. And of course, she misheard. The sale price was actually $50,000. But St. Elizabeth and the local church diocese said, we're going to make this happen. And through loans and contributions and fundraisers, they were able to raise the $50,000 for the purchase price. William Ernst, who was a local official, who was the father of one of our state senators, actually filed a lawsuit against the city of Covington, trying to prevent the city from giving money to the Catholic Church and therefore to the hospital. His argument was that it was a violation of the separation of church and state. Out of respect, St. Elizabeth Hospital turned down the offer of $10,000 from the city of from the city of Covington. But that actually worked in the favor of the hospital, because people saw it as the hospital doing the right thing, and therefore contributions gained greatly because after that event. So the new hospital opened in the spring of 1868. And this place was at the time considered state of the art. So I've got a picture here of the back of the St. Elizabeth Hospital, and it had some wonderful features. This hospital now, instead of having 10 beds, had a capacity of 100 beds. So it was 10 times larger. It had a built-in chapel, which was kind of nice. You also see this on this picture, you see there's these squares, sort of square towers in the corner of the building. There's one here on the left next to the church, and there's one over on the right you can barely see through the trees. Those were 4-story outhouses. Basically, an outhouse that worked on each floor. Of course, there was a lot of running jokes about that. You know, look out below. Maybe the more expensive rooms were at the top of the hospital, but one way or the other, it had indoor plumbing, if you want to call it that. It also had the ability to have a lot more fresh air, which was believed to be very healthy at the time. Again, depending on the distance from the outhouses. They also kept a commercial cooking pot going out in the courtyard. You can't see it because of the trees here. But they had this communal stew pot, and they would go out and get food and things and cook them in the pot. So there was always this soup that was available for the patients anytime they needed it. There was also something very interesting, and this is 1868, so this is kind of interesting what's going on. But do you see the building on the left side of the picture? You see there's the chapel or the church, and then there's a small house, a wooden frame house with a little steeple on top over in the left-hand corner of the photograph. According to Sanborn maps, which are fire insurance maps that tell us what each part of the building is used for, this was labeled as the dead house. And this is where, when people passed away, this is where they were kept until they could be properly disposed of. Now, this is really important because at this time, there was a rash of body snatching going on. It was illegal in America to give autopsies, to have autopsies done at hospitals and medical schools. The only autopsies could be performed was on condemned prisoners. So unfortunately, medical schools had to resort to other means of getting bodies. So they actually would rob graves, they would rob hospitals, they did a lot of things in order to obtain new, fresh corpses. And of course, depending on what the corpse was the value was greater or less. For example, of course, you can imagine most prisoners that were condemned to be autopsied were older or middle-aged men who had done some great crime. Of course, there wasn't any women, there wasn't young women, there wasn't old people, there wasn't children. Those were the bodies that were more valuable. A standard body could get you $30, which at that time would pay your rent at a decent apartment for about 6 months. So there was a lot of money being exchanged. So I can imagine that they built this building in order to be sure that the dead from the hospital would be taken care of until they could be properly removed and buried. There's a number of cemeteries around this area that if you look, you'll see stone buildings usually in the corner. A lot of times they'll tell you that those are maintenance buildings. They were actually for storing corpses to keep them from being stolen. So it's a very interesting part of our history. Anyway, I digress. But this was what the hospital looked like when it opened in 1868. Quite an improvement over a storefront, if you ask me. One of the other things that the hospital had was a state-of-the-art surgery room. Well, state-of-the-art for the time. This is a photograph of a surgery about that time. You'll notice that nobody's wearing masks, nobody's wearing gloves. They didn't have those kind of things, and they did not show up till later. It's rather interesting how our ancestors survived, but things were very primitive, and sometimes the only medicine was ether in order to let people be unconscious during surgery. So this is an interesting photograph. It is not of St. Elizabeth Hospital, but is a time period of the same, showing doctors performing surgery. So from 1868 to about 1909, that was St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And of course, they outgrew it. It became too small. One of the other disadvantages of it is that all the rooms were connected. So if you needed to get from a room on one side of the building to a room on the other side of the building, there was no central hallway. You had to go through other rooms to get to the room that you wanted to. It was really poorly designed. But by 1909, things were completely different. There was no opposition to a new hospital. In fact, it was something that the city was 100% behind because they were afraid that it didn't reflect well on the city not to have a great hospital, which is ironic from how long, just in the short 50 years, how far they had come. So they built a brand new hospital on 20th Street, which opened in August of 1914. And one of the other wonderful things about this, it boasted 340 beds capacity. It had a nursing school. It had surgery rooms and a maternity ward, which was rather interesting because very few hospitals at the time had a maternity ward. And in fact, it was interesting because it caused an internal conflict whether the hospital should have one or not. And it was finally when the Archdiocese put its foot down and said, this hospital will have a maternity ward. And it added to the debate, and they opened a maternity ward. So an institution that was reluctantly accepted was now one of the defining institutions of the region. And it's interesting how far people came and how much their attitude changed. So it's interesting, and I love this story because I have had, I don't know whether you call it the privilege, but I've been in St. Elizabeth Hospital a number of times, and I've had some important surgeries there. And it makes me think back about the first hospital that opened in a storefront that people didn't want, and now they're our biggest employer. They have over 8,000 employees, a number of locations, multiple specialties. It really defines Northern Kentucky, and I would say that most people would point at the St. Elizabeth system and say this is one of the best places that the nation has when it comes to healthcare, and we are blessed to have it. I've noticed that I'm at the end of my time, so I'm going to throw up my last slide. If you can compare this to what the first hospital looked like, this is the new hospital in Edgewood. And I think it's kind of a testimony of what people can overcome when they're doing the right thing. So I will now open the floor to questions, and I really look forward to hearing what you folks have to say. So let me stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hackett. I think you stumped everybody with the trivia question. We had some guesses, but I don't know if you wanted to give another hint and maybe.
It's probably the last thing anybody ever wants. Does that help?
Okay, let's see if we get any other guesses. Go ahead and Heather, you want to repeat that question again? Do you have that handy?
Yeah, so Henrietta Scott Cleveland, who was the true inspiration for the founding of the hospital, had one request on her behalf of the sisters. What was that request and when was it fulfilled?
Okay, so let's go ahead and get to some questions. Do you want to start, Heather?
Yeah, so we had one that was, what street was the second hospital on?
It was on 20th. It's actually between 20th and 21st Street.
Okay. And someone else just asked, what year did the St. Elizabeth Covington close?
That's a good question because I think it was actually operating in some capacity until fairly recently, maybe in the last 20 years. But that I'd have to look it up. But I think they kept it as a school and offices for quite a while after it officially closed.
When was it named St. Elizabeth?
St. Elizabeth was from the very start. It was dedicated to St. Elizabeth because St. Elizabeth was a patron saint of poor people. And so that was the name of the hospital since its very beginning.
Okay, we did have a couple comments. Somebody said they used to be close to Sister Rose Margaret Delaney from Falmouth in Northern Kentucky in the 1980s, who was the head of the International Order. And he also said his wife, Joanne, and Sister Rose traveled together in Italy on business and pleasure. Sister Rose was not happy with the Vatican discrimination against women.
I can believe that. It's funny because, and I don't know quite how to spin this, but these women came up with the idea of a hospital, but then they had to go through the motions of having the male dominated, like the bishop and to endorse it. And so then it became their idea. And the sisters and the women were just going to implement the idea of the men. But obviously the women did it. It's just, just the way the hierarchy is, that no good idea can come from a woman. It has to be approved and therefore become the ownership of the males.
Okay, we haven't gotten any correct answers to trivia. So you want to go ahead and give the correct answer, and maybe we'll give just the first part and see.
Well, let me give them another clue.
Okay.
It's definitely a granite or concrete request. And it's the
Worst
last thing you'd ever want.
you'd ever want. Okay.
And then if nobody gets it in the next minute or two, I'll toss it out.
Okay. We do have another question. Someone said, are the Franciscan Sisters still associated with St. E's?
I do believe so, that it's still associated with the Catholic Church. Up until the 1950s, I think, it was led by a member. One of the sisters was the executive of the hospital. And then that changed, and then they brought in professional, largely male CEOs after that. But yeah, the nuns they're still there.
I like this question that just came up because it made me start thinking. Because they asked, were the first sisters trained nurses? Because they were the ones taking care of the people, correct?
Right, but I don't think there was such a thing as trained nurses back then. These women did the best they could with what they had to work with. And I don't think they were trained at all, other than they had big, caring, open hearts.
Uh-oh, we might have got an answer that's somewhat correct here. You want to read it, Heather?
He said to be buried on property with a monument.
I think that's close enough. She wanted a headstone. In fact, she was buried, and then they didn't erect a headstone until 2011. And that's when they finally erected a headstone over her grave. And that's all she had requested from the sisters, is they give her a headstone. And now there's a statue of St. Elizabeth, I believe, over her. To be honest with her, knowing her, she didn't care, probably. I mean, what she had to go through and all the spears and arrows that were shot at her because of who she was and who she worked with and that kind of thing.
Why do you think it took so long for that to happen?
I think that they were just so distracted on so many things. There were so many things going on that they just basically forgot the promise. And like I said, I don't think she cared in the least. There's this great song by Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, and there's a line in one of the songs that says something along the lines of tombstones cheer the living dear, they're no use to the dead. And I think that finally, because there were so many changeovers, so much going on, that they finally, and she didn't want to make a big deal of her funeral anyway. So I think it's a great story, and I think it's that she and Shriver and Parker and all those people are finally getting their due, and I think that's great. Always my mother said, if you ever want something done, ask a woman.
Somebody just asked as well, were there any doctors at the hospital at first?
There were visiting doctors that would come. And in fact, I think that because St. Elizabeth's here, that brought doctors to the area, and it really opened the idea of a medical practice. One of the great doctors, and I'm sure she practiced at St. E's, was I'm drawing a blank. Louise. She's buried up here in Green Mountain Cemetery, in Evergreen Cemetery. I want to say Wilder, but that's not it. Southgate, Louise Southgate. She was one of the first women to get a medical degree to be a doctor, and I think she was like the only one in her class, only woman in her class. And she had monumental fights. And one of her fights that she had with the medical profession was the argument of whether women should be given painkillers during childbirth. Because people would argue that in the Bible, it says that part of women's punishment would be that they would suffer childbirth. And that was one of their punishments for betraying Adam in the Garden of Eden. And her argument, of course, that was stupid. but also that when the only time in recorded history when a man gave birth was when God took Adam's rib out to make Eve, and he gave him something so that Adam would sleep. So if painkiller is good for a man giving birth, then painkiller should be good for a woman giving birth. So yeah, but I'm sure she practiced there. And I'm sure she was influenced by the women that were there. There's another one of those great women in history that we have just passed over.
And you know what's great as well is that our winner for the trivia question, she said, by the way, I was born there at St. E's. And she said her daughter is a nurse practitioner there, along with her husband, of course, in Edgewood. Pretty cool.
It's pretty cool. And to think there was a time when people thought this was a bad idea, and it just racks the brain. I would love to take, especially William Ernst, who is so much against the hospital at the time, bring him to 2024 and have him stand in front of St. Elizabeth's Hospital and say, you tried to prevent this. You tried to prevent this, I'm sorry. I live for thrills like that.
Yeah, I love the stories, and I know some other people have commented about the stories about some of the first patients, and it makes it real, to hear those personal stories that you've researched. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And for more Northern Kentucky history throughout the week, check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, where you can find the latest curators chat and all of our past Northern Kentucky History Hour presentations. Please like and subscribe. That's all we have time for this evening. Thank you again to all of the sponsors and supporters of BCM. Until next time, take care, everyone, and good night. Thank you again, Dr. Hackett, for the excellent presentation.